All right, welcome everybody to the first Developer Hours of 2024. Developer Hours is a event series that we try and run every month, so maybe sometimes a couple times a month. And the goal of this series is to provide developer-oriented content to you all folks in the WordPress community. My name is Nick Diego. I'm a developer advocate working on WordPress, and I'm sponsored by Automatic, and I'm joined by my co-host Ryan Welcher. I'll let him introduce himself in 1 second. And the purpose of this series is to engage with the community, but it's also to get developers in the community to share their own expertise. A lot of the presentations are done by Ryan, myself, and our colleagues, but if there's any developer out there that would like to share their expertise, something they're building, something that they're proud of, this is a great venue for that. So I just want to put that out there. We're entering the new year. We have a lot of events planned for the rest of the year, and this is a venue to speak to other developers and share what you know and how to be the best developer you can to be in the WordPress space. So with that, I'll let Ryan introduce himself and share a little bit about who he is and what he does.
Thank you, sir. My name is Ryan Welcher. I'm also a developer advocate. Nick and I work on the same team, sponsored by Automatic. I've been a developer for a long time. I used to work at agencies for stuff. I've done a lot of block development. Anyways, I'm sure you've seen me around the Twitter sphere or X sphere, whatever it's called now. And yeah, so it's so glad everyone can make it, and really, and just any questions that you have in the chat, just or we'll drop any questions in the chat, and we'll try to get them answered. And yeah, let's build some blocks.
Yeah. So full disclosure, this presentation today took zero preparation, but that's purposeful. In the last 6 months, folks in the community, contributors, have been working hard to improve the documentation for the block editor in WordPress. And one of the areas that a lot of focus has been put on is the getting started section. And so let me see if I can drop that here in the chat, just a quick link. So the getting started section is to help you get started building blocks and working with the block editor in WordPress. And part of that work was to develop a tutorial on building your first block. That tutorial is live. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through that tutorial. So hopefully not everybody just leaves and goes, does the tutorial on their own. But this is an opportunity for us to walk through it as a group, for you to ask questions about different steps along the way. And hopefully either the tutorial is fantastic and there's no questions and everyone's great, or if there are questions, we can improve that tutorial, because the goal is to make that tutorial the best getting started guide for building a block in WordPress. So what I'm going to do with Ryan's help is we are going to build the block that's presented in the tutorial by literally following those steps. And I really encourage you to ask questions if something doesn't make sense. And if you want to follow along at home, by all means, the tutorial is there and it's designed for you to be able to do it on your own. But yeah, that's what we're going to do today. And hopefully for those who have never built a block before, or those who have tried and didn't quite get to the end of it, hopefully this provides a path to actually build your first block and feel a bit more comfortable with developing blocks in WordPress. Quick question: will this block be built off an existing theme? So the great thing about building blocks is generally the theme does not matter. So we are going to be using just a blank WordPress install that's running the 2024 theme, but it could be applied to any theme. So I'm going to start share my screen, and we are just going to follow the tutorial and build a block. All right, so you should see my screen. And on the right here, we have the tutorial. And Ryan put that in the chat. So if you want to find the direct link there, it's in the chat. And on the left-hand side, I have VS Code, just a code editor. You can use any code editor you want. Now, when you're building a block, there's a handful of prerequisites. So let me talk about the prerequisites, and then I'm skipping steps in the tutorial, but the prerequisites are you need to have a code editor. In this case, I'm using VS Code. You need to have a local WordPress development environment. In this presentation, we're going to use WP-ENV, but you may have heard of other things like MAMP or local WP. Really, any local WordPress development environment works. We're just having to use WP-ENV for this. And then you need Node and NPM installed on your machine. So what are we going to build today? What we're going to do is we're going to build a copyright date block, basically a block that displays the current year with like a little copyright symbol. And basically it will update every year. So you never have to worry about updating the copyright on your site anymore. So it's a practical block, but a very simple block, which is good when you're building something for the first time. So again, if we come down to the tutorial here, we say our prerequisites are, we have a code editor, we need a Node.js development tools, and a local WordPress environment. Now, we've done a lot of work to provide resources about each one of those. So for example, Node.js development tools, if you come up here into our getting started section, we have an entire section on block development environments, and there's a whole page on Node.js development environment. So normally we're sharing like tons of links, in these presentations to different resources and blog articles and whatnot. But we're kind of at a place now, thankfully, where most of those resources are all collectively in one place in that getting started section. So as you go through this tutorial and as we talk today, all the resources are in one place. They're in that getting started section. So I've already installed Node on my machine. I have my code editor, which is VS Code, and we're going to be using WP-ENV for a local environment, which we'll get to later. So I am at this point set to begin the tutorial. And just for clarification, those three things you will need to build any block. You'll need those to build any extension for the block editor. Those are just prerequisites you basically need to do any modern WordPress development. So whether you're building a block or not, those are some good things to have, and many of you probably already have those prerequisites taken care of. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to build the block from quote unquote scratch, but we're not going to scaffold the block plugin from scratch. I would highly advise against doing things completely from scratch unless you have a very specific need to do so. We're going to be using a tool called the Create Block tool. We've done presentations on this last year. There's great resources in the documentation on how to use Create Block. But what this tool does is it allows you to scaffold the plugin, because a block needs to be inserted into WordPress, and almost always you're going to be doing that in a plugin. So it basically creates the wrapper plugin and scaffolds the block for you. Then we can go in there and start making modifications to make a copyright date block. But what we're going to do is we're just going to use a command here. Let's minimize my little window. And we're basically going to run this command. And if you're in the tutorial, literally you can just copy and paste. And this will scaffold the block for you. Now, there's one step that I'm going to do beforehand, and that is I'm going to create a folder on my computer where I want this block to live. Now, if you were using like local WP, you probably have a local site already set up and you have the plugins folder. You would create that folder there, or sorry, you would run this command there. Because I'm using WP-ENV, which is a little bit of a unique local development environment, I can put that folder anywhere. So on my desktop, I have just a folder that says block tutorial. So what we're going to do is we're going to open the folder, go to desktop, block tutorial. So now I'm in that folder in my code editor. So then I can open up the terminal, make this a little bit bigger for us. So you can see that I'm inside of the folder that I created and I'm in my terminal. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this command here. And what this is going to do is this is going to scaffold a block with the slug copyright date block, and it's going to make it a dynamic block. We'll talk about the variant in a second, but I'm just going to run this command and let it start going. Yes. Yeah, you might get some prompts as you're doing this. You just click through the prompts and continue along the way. And you can see here that it's working. It's creating this copyright date block folder. It's installing a bunch of stuff. This might take a few minutes to complete. Just kind of let it run, do its thing.
So that's running, Nick. Sorry, Lisa's got a question about is there a strong advantage for using WP-ENV instead of local WP? Is it simpler, more beginner friendly? I can answer that, or if you want to answer that, whichever. It is up to you which you use. Local WP provides a user interface like a GUI, so you can, so that might be even a little bit easier for beginners. WP-ENV is Docker based, so if you're more comfortable with Docker, and you can do that. I think it's sort of like pick your flavor. They're both equally great and do the job. So there's no real the one thing, like WP-ENV is open source and it is provided by the WordPress community, so I would probably skew a bit towards that, but that's just my personal choice. But I think either one is a perfectly valid tool, and yeah, depends on your comfort level with things like Docker. Sorry, Nick, continue.
No, that's great. And honestly, if you're happy with your current local development environment, there's no need to change, unless you're having trouble with it, or it can't do something, and you're looking for another solution. Just stick with what you're comfortable with. You can build a block anywhere. It's not dependent on the local environment. The one neat thing about the create block tool is that it does allow you to run WP-ENV directly after the create block tool is run. So again, it's really up to however you want to work. And so just quickly on WP-ENV, there is a article here all about WP-ENV, and it also a little diagram to show how it works and what you need to use it and whatnot. I'll admit I use local forever, and then I started using WP-ENV more, but it was a little daunting because you need Docker, it's more in the terminal, so it can be a little bit daunting at first. But selfishly, I think that this article helps clear a lot of that up. So, all right. So what we've done here, excuse me, is we have the block has been scaffolded or bootstrapped, and you'll see that we have this folder over here called copyright date block. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enter that folder by CD copyright date block. So now I am in that folder. And let's take a look at the folder to see what it did. We can see here, I'm just zoom in a little bit more. We can see that we have a bunch of stuff. Now, if you were to write this by hand, it would take you forever, right? So using the create block, I always recommend, Ryan, we always recommend use the create block tool to scaffold your blocks and makes your life so much easier. First thing first is you're going to have that main plugin file. This is the main PHP file that every plugin needs. It's got the name of the block. It's got some additional content, which we'll talk about in a second. Then what we have is, you'll see this a lot in block development. We have a SRC or source folder. This contains all of the files that you will be directly editing when you're developing your block. Modern JavaScript development requires a build process for the most part, or generally when you build blocks, you're going to be using a build process. What that means is you're going to be editing your files in the source folder, and then there's a process behind the scenes that is then going to take those files and quote unquote build them into these production ready files that are in your build folder. The reason this happens is because there is code that you're going to use to work when you're working in the editor that's using React and JSX, which needs to be compiled into standard JavaScript in order to work in your browser. So you need this build process. And generally that's pretty challenging to set up and create, but CreateBlock does it all for you. And that's one of the benefits of this. So just to quickly, let's continue to move down into our into the tutorial. At this point, we built the block. We can technically walk away, because we built the block. Of course, we want to modify it and make it the copyright date block. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do is it NPX? I think it is. Let's see here. I think all right.
You need yeah. You can install it locally, but I think you can also run npx at WordPress/andv.
We'll just do this real quick. So this is gonna this part is not outlined in the tutorial. Oh, I know why. That is a good thing that part of these demonstrations and presentations is to also find ways that we can improve the documentation. I don't think that this tutorial, and I actually know this tutorial, does not actually include a wp-env.json file, which is part of the little bit of the struggle that I'm running into here. So I'll fix that after the fact. But normally what you'd be able to do is just run npx wp-env start, and it would start. So ignore the last 10 seconds of what I just did there, because we'll update the tutorial with that to make it a little bit simpler for those that want to use wp-env.
Yeah. If you do use wp-env a lot, there's no harm in installing it locally. I haven't installed locally. That's what Nick was doing with the npm install, the -g. It's a flag to say install this thing globally. It just saves you having to add it to your package or to your project for every single one if you just have it installed locally. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that.
Absolutely.
The create block package, you can actually pass a flag to it as well that will add it to your project. I can't remember what the flag is called off the top of my head. I'll look it up. But anyways, that's in the weeds about create block. We don't have to get into that too much right now.
Right, you're right. So if that flag was passed, when you did the create block, it would have included the wp-env.json file, and then we could have just run what we were trying to run before. So, but we're up and running now, and so if we go to this link here, you can see that I have just a standard WordPress development environment, and we can log in here. And then if we go to plugins, we can see that we have the copyright date block installed and activated. So if we come over here to pages, let's create a new one. We can add the copyright date block as you would normally. Now, this is what, when you scaffold using create block, this is what it looks like by default. It's just some default content. You got a little smiley face. It's going to look this way every time. And when we view our page, you can see it says hello from a dynamic block. And if we look at the editor, it's going to say hello from the editor. This is just to show you that there's, content that's or markup that's in the editor, and then there's stuff on the front end as well. So at this point, we built a block, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep going with the tutorial. But this is kind of a process that you're always going to run through. You're going to scaffold your block, and this is what you're going to get. Caveat, you can do templates, and there are other ways to modify the create block package, but that's beyond the discussion today.
Quick question in the chat from Thomas. Is it recommended to include all your custom blocks as plugins, or can you include them in your theme? The recommended approach is to put them in plugins, but it will work in themes. It really depends on what you're doing. And I, as a developer, I'd probably, I also hate it when someone answers a question with depends on what you're doing, but that's literally the case here. It depends on what you're doing. If you have a theme that has very, very, very bespoke markup that you'll never ever see anywhere else, and you have a block that adds to that, it might be better served to be in your theme. But you can't add blocks to themes that are being added to the WordPress theme repository. Those all have to be in plugins. So the short answer is put it in a plugin unless you really, really, really need to put it in the theme. What if you have multiple? Can you package them in one plugin? Yes, you absolutely can. That's a topic for a different developer hours, but you can have one plugin with multiple blocks. It works out of the box. You just have to structure your plugin in a certain way. Basically, put a folder inside your source directory with a block.json for every block.
Exactly. Again, I don't want to, for those that maybe you're building, this is the first time you're seeing a block being built, I don't want to detract too much from that. But in your source folder, you'd have block 1, block 2, individual folders, and you'd have the individual structure in there for those.
Yep. There's a follow-up question. Maybe I missed this at the start. How is this rendering in WP already without being included as a plugin or in a theme? The WP env package, basically, when it runs it from inside the directory of the plugin, which is where Nick, I think, is running it from, it knows that you want this to be a plugin, so it just automatically installs it for you. So that's one of the benefits of it. You don't have to put it. It basically just figures it out for you for the most part. So that's a benefit of WP env. If you weren't using WP env, you would have to have the file in your local install, whatever that would be. Yeah, if this was WP, if you were in local WP, you would have had to put this plugin inside your plugins directory, which is inside WP content, and then you would have to go in there and manually enable it the way you would normally install a plugin. But WP env does some tricksy magic to figure out that you want this thing activated.
Yeah, so just see how we're in the block tutorial folder, and you can see that folder here. Imagine this folder is just the plugins folder in your local WP environment. You do the same step, you just make sure you're in the plugins folder and then do all the steps that we just did. But because I'm using WP env, I can use any folder that I want. So I just used a folder on my desktop. So
it's very, very handy, especially if you have a standalone plugin that you don't want to bundle an entire theme with, or an entire WordPress install.
Exactly. Okay, so let's keep marching through this. And there was a direct message sent to me about a recording for this. Yes, there will be a recording. It's going to be on WordPress TV. It's also going to be on YouTube. So we'll post the links to the recording after the in the Meetup comments on Meetup, and then it will be available on the main WordPress channel on YouTube, also on WordPress TV. Okay, so at this point, we have our scaffolded plugin. You know, we're ready to start making edits, and we're ready to start developing. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to run, and there's a bunch of commands here that it gives you prompts to show you what you can do. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do NPM Start. This is going to start the build for development. What this is going to do is it's going to watch all of the files in my source folder, and whenever I save one of them, it's going to update the build files, which are the production-ready versions of those files that the block actually uses in WordPress. The source folders are just for development, but then they're built and compiled into the build files in the build folder. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by doing npm start. And it's going to spit out this output here. And we're just going to let it run. So now we're going to start making changes to files, and you'll see every time I make a save, it's going to update the files. And this is what we talk about, is the build process, and the create block package handles it all for you. It looks overwhelming and complicated, but you just run npm start, work on the block, and in the behind the scenes, it's just making the updates for you automatically. So let's start by looking at the block.json file. This is arguably one of the most important files for the block. It explains what the block's about. You can register supports and attributes and all sorts of stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by just making a really simple change. We're going to start by removing that smiley face. We're going to get rid of that smiley face. You can see it says icon smiley. Get rid of that. And we're going to change the description to say display your site's copyright date. So here's our description. We're going to change this to say display your site's copyright date. Okay. We're going to save that. Now, before I save it, take a look at this block.json. You'll see it says smiley and it has the old description. When I save this, come over here, now you can see that those have been updated. So that's that build process in action behind the scenes. Now, when I come over to the editor and I refresh my page here, you'll see that that smiley face is gone and it says display your site's copyright date. First edit complete. We saved the file. Now we can move on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add some block supports. Block supports are really, really important. They make it easy for you. Basically, there's a certain set of supports that you can register when you're creating a block that provide functionality directly to the block that you don't have to code, you don't have to modify, it just gives it to the block. And a couple good ones are like color, typography. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add those to our block. And you can see by just adding these additional lines, all of a sudden our block will have color control and it will have typography control. So I'm going to come into the support section and just replace this. Now, in the tutorial, there's a link to the block supports documentation section where you can see all the different supports that are available, but we're just going to use these simple ones for now. I'm going to save my file again. Again, take a look. Block.json is updated with those changes in the build folder. And now we refresh the editor. And now when we click on the block, you'll see that we now have color and we have typography. And it works. Go to the front end. It works. So we didn't have to code anything, right? We just registered support. Can do small. Now we have small. Now the color is going to somewhat work. Well, the color is going to work. But we have this blue color that's provided by the scaffold. We'll change that later. But you can see here that I know this is not an accessible color, but just for the sake of this, we can see that the color also works. So supports, again, make your life really easy. Before you start adding custom functionality to your block, see if there's a support available that does that already for you. All right, where are we? Okay, so we've done our supports. Now what we're going to do is we're going to remove some quote unquote unnecessary code. This is something where you kind of have to understand what this code is doing before you start removing it. But the way that the create block package works is it kind of gives you everything that you might need. And then from there, you can remove things that you don't need. So there are some specifications in the block.json file that we do not need. And so we're going to go ahead and remove those. So for example, we do not need this editor style. So those are the styles that are being provided to the block. Occasionally, you might need to register some custom editor styling in the editor. I can't think of something offhand, but maybe there's some custom UI that you need for your block. This is a way to provide that. We do not need that. We also don't need any styles on the front end, right? Because we're going to use supports to handle the styling of our block completely. But there are many cases where you need custom styles for your block, and this is a way to provide that. You basically provide the path to those CSS files, and then WordPress and block.json does the rest for you. So I don't need those for this block because we're keeping it pretty simple. So I'm just going to remove them. Save. Well, sorry, made a big mistake. I edited the build folder file. So we're going to come back down here to source and actually make the change where we should be making the change. Okay. And we also don't need ViewScript. So ViewScript is a file that you can use for front-end JavaScript. So maybe you have a sophisticated block that's like a carousel or something, and you need some front-end JavaScript. This is the how you would specify that. We don't need that for this plugin, so we're going to remove that as well. So basically, we just simplified our block.json. Now, if I take a look at my block again, I'll refresh here. You can see that the built-in styles that came with the scaffold went away because I removed the specification for the style sheet that provided those files. You can actually see that style sheet here, editor.scss. We'll remove that later, but I just want to show you that it's here. And we also have that style.css, which is providing that the front-end styles, or the styles that are used in both the front end and the back end. If you ever have a question about what do these files do, there are some handy descriptions at the top of each file that kind of explains how it works. And there's also some links to documentation where you can learn more. So this not only is the create block tool great for scaffolding, but it also provides you reference about what each file does in the file itself. Let's change the text color to black, back to black, or we'll just clear that. That way we're in line with our tutorial. All right, so we've basically done everything that we need to do with block.json. We can leave that there for now, and we can move on to the next step. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Yeah, there's a question about, this is kind of a side. I don't think this is possible, but James Lau asked about keeping the inspector controls, the ability. So like if you had sort of all your typography controls, for example, having them all open and expanded rather than having to go in and turn them on every time. I don't believe there's a way of enabling that out of the box. Like, so the little, like the 3-dot menu there, like if you were to click on that beside typography, you've got all the tools. I don't think there's a way to have them all expanded by default.
There is actually.
Oh, well, there you go.
It is an
Nice.
experimental property though.
That you can enable through block.json?
Yep.
Nice.
Little deviation from what we were talking about, but I think it's important. Whenever I have a deep question about this stuff, I always just kind of go look at the block library in Gutenberg. It's a great reference for this. Now I just need to try to figure out what would be a good
paragraph block, maybe, or
cover. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay. So it's called experimental default controls. And you basically can set the different parameters or the properties that you want to be turned on by default. So for example, if we had typography here, you'd do something like this. You do experimental default controls. I'm forgetting some of the typography controls off the top of my head here.
font family.
Okay. Yeah. So for example, if we wanted line height, for example, to be turned on by default, we could do experimental font style. A lot of the more advanced font things are still experimental. Hopefully that will change in the future. But
And be careful. You need to be careful when using experimental, because experimental could mean that it's only available with the Gutenberg plugin, and not necessarily available in the latest version of WordPress. So experimental is just that. It's experimental. It's subject to change, breaking changes possibly, or removal altogether, depending on what the experiment yields. So it's possible, but I would, with great power comes great responsibility. So just make sure that if you're doing this, that you know it's going to work in the environment that you want to use it on. But yeah, looks like it's possible.
it does look like it's possible, but there's something not quite right. Experimental default controls, font size, true. Oh, wait a second. I know why. Okay, so I was wondering why for example, it wasn't working. So the way when you so this is quite the we're moving away from the tutorial, but when you're registering block supports, I basically set default controls without actually enabling that functionality. So you have to first obviously enable the functionality to make the block have font style, font weight, whatever. And then you can tell it, okay, I want certain ones to be default or not. So I just didn't actually tell the block that it needed to have those additional functionalities. So now when we refresh, you can see that we have line height. I don't think, let's see here, appearance. Something else is not quite right here.
You may need the Gutenberg plugin
Yeah, we
enabled.
might need to do a plugin as well. So like, yeah,
Just some of
exactly.
those
So
things.
this is an example of where some things aren't in core, but are in the Gutenberg plugin. Um, but yeah. So, but that's how you would do it. So imagine all these things are no longer experimental and they're just in core. This is how you would do it. You would basically define default controls as true. This way of doing things is once it becomes non-experimental will be possible, and then everything will appear here.
Yeah, we're in the weeds a little bit with the experimental stuff. So maybe we should disregard, and because it does get a bit complicated, especially for those new to block development.
But it does not detract from the fact that ignoring all experimental, block.json is a great way to register supports for functionality that is non-experimental in WordPress. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to start actually editing the block content itself. You know, we've made some changes to color and typography, but we actually want to start changing the content. We want it to you know, modify what the block looks like. And we also want to make the block recognizable from the user so that they can insert it. Because right now, if you look at the block here, it just has like this weird like Lego block icon. It's not really recognizable for the user when they're trying to insert it. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to add a custom icon. You're probably going to do this a lot when you're building custom blocks. So where you're going to do that, you'll remember that we removed the icon property here. So you can do icon like this, and you can pass a string. This is a string to a dash icon, if you're familiar with those. More often than not, you're probably going to want to do a custom icon, usually an SVG. So more often than not, you're probably going to remove that. Then what you can do is in the index file. So there's a lot of information about how this index file works. But basically, this is where you're actually registering the custom block type in the client, in the editor. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to add a property called icon. And we are going to add an SVG icon. So I'm going to call it calendar icon. And now I actually have to tell it what calendar icon is. And so I'm just going to copy this example here. So this is just an SVG. I copied this from the Gutenberg storybook. So I'll just show you this here. This is a great place to pull in to use any of the icons that are already provided by WordPress. This is a great reference for that. Again, the link is in the tutorial. So I just copied the SVG from there and I created my variable here. And now when I save, not that, I'm going to save this. Now we looked at block.json in source and block.json in build. They look very similar, but let's take a look at index and source and index and build. This looks a lot different, right? So this is that build process at work. So I just wanted to note the difference there. Then when we come back over to edit, we refresh, and now we have a nice calendar icon. Keep scrolling down the page here. Now let's start making some changes to the actual content in the editor that we see here. Instead of saying copyright date block, hello from the editor, let's actually change that so that we are actually viewing what we want is the current year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the edit function. This is I always get this wrong. Component, Ryan? Function?
Technically it is a component because it's an uppercase E.
Perfect.
That's how you can tell something's a React component when it's an uppercase E or uppercase.
Uppercase E. So we are in our
Well, it doesn't always have to be upper. Well, a React component must be uppercase, but a function can also be uppercase named. But anyways, I'm being pedantic.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to copy this variable. And what this is doing is this is just using a built-in JavaScript function for creating a date and getting the full year, and then we're converting that to a string. Now, if this line is something you didn't know, I would strongly encourage you to check out ChatGPT. No, but in all honesty, like there's a lot of code that you can get a lot of helpful hints from AI. We've been using it a ton in a lot of the work that we're doing. So, but if you didn't know how to do things like get the current year, AI is a handy way to point you in the right direction. So now we have our current year. And we just need to add this to replace the text that says copyright date blocks. We don't need that anymore. We just need to display, oops, not that. We just need to display our current year. Just like that. Now this use block props, this is basically a providing the classes, the styles, everything that the editor needs to properly display that block. So in order for, you know, the wrapper and everything to make sure that the color works, that's all being handled by use block props. You don't need to worry about that. You just need to make sure you're including that as part of the paragraph markup or whatever the markup you have built for your block. When we save this now and we refresh, you can now see it says 2024. Let's add a little copyright icon, make it a little bit more accurate. And we'll save. Okay, I made a mistake here. This copyright needs to be outside of that. There we go. Now you can see actually, this is actually pretty handy. When I made an error that would break things, you can see here in the terminal, I'm getting this error to point you in the right direction around what did you break? And now we're good. We'll refresh. And now we have our copyright icon. Make this large so we can see it with the current year. If we update this, if we look at the front end, it is not updated. That's because we haven't handled the front end part of it yet, only the editor. All right, so now we need to update that front end part. Now, when you're doing a dynamic block, what's rendered on the front end is handled in the render.php file. I don't want to get into too long of a conversation in terms of dynamic versus static. There's a lot of documentation around that in the Getting Started guide. A dynamic block is one where you're rendering all the content from the block at the time the block is rendered using PHP. It's a very handy way, simple way to build blocks, especially if you're coming from a PHP background. If you're coming from a PHP background, I highly recommend starting with this type of approach, which is why we built the tutorial in this way. The second half of the tutorial, which we're not going to get to today, is about how to add static rendering as well. So I encourage you to walk through that after. But this is definitely the easiest way, in my opinion, to get started building a block. But now what we need to do is we just need to update, like we did in the editor, the content here to modify it. So we're going to do the exact same thing, and we're going to use similar setup. We're going to replace that with copyright icon, and then we're going to echo date, capital Y for just the current year. Save that. And now on the front end, you can see it says copyright 2024. Let's continue. We're going to skip the cleaning up. Feel free to read through that. We're just going to remove files we don't need. I want to see if we can get this adding block attributes done in the next few minutes, because I think this is like a very important key part that really kind of ties the room together when it comes to building blocks. Right now, basically what we've done is we've added the same content in both places, right? In our edit function, we have the JavaScript version of displaying the current year, and the render.php, we have the PHP version of the same thing. There's really no connection between the two other than those block supports, because those block supports, which are provided to those block by the get block wrapper attributes on the front end, and then in the editor provided by the use block props. So the supports are put in both places and you don't have to recode all that. But there's not a whole lot of connection between the two. Block attributes provide you a way to pass functionality, to store functionality on the block, and then use that on the front end. I didn't explain that well, but you'll see what I mean when we start putting this together. So what I want to do is, you'll see this a lot in a lot of websites. Instead of just saying copyright 2024, it will say like 2000 to 2024. So what I want to do is I want to create a field in the editor where a user can type in that starting year, and then that gets appended to our year. So what I'm going to do is we're going to come down here and we need to create some attributes. Attributes are what you're going to use to store that information. So in our block.json file, I'm going to create two attributes. We need a new property here called attributes. One is going to be show starting year. It's going to be Boolean, so true or false. And then the starting year, which is going to be a string, which is where you're going to type in the starting year. Block.json is done. Now we need to actually add the way for the user to make those changes. And we're going to do that in our edit component by first pulling in another WordPress component called inspector controls. So we're just going to copy here. You're going to pull this from the WordPress/block editor package. So now we have our inspector controls. Inspector controls allows you to render additional panels here on the block, where you can add settings and add things that the user can use to modify the block. So let's do a simple thing. We're going to do inspector controls testing. Now you'll see here that we have an error. When this is JSX syntax, we need to wrap everything in a single container. So this is a little bit nuanced here. There is a call out about it. You have to wrap it in a fragment. So that's what we're doing here, just making sure everything is wrapped in one container. And when we save this, come over here, you can now see it says testing, right? Pretty straightforward. Now what we need to do is we actually need to add places where people can start editing the settings that we have set up for them in block.json. So I'm going to come back over to the imports, and I'm going to import a few more components. And I'm going to do this from the WordPress components package. So much like this is laid out, and do this. Now, if this is the first time you've ever seen this, don't worry. But this is a process that you will replicate over and over and over again when you build blocks. Basically, you want to import WordPress components that are already built for you, so you don't have to do them yourself. You don't have to create your own text control. You don't have to create your own toggle control. Just use the ones that are provided by WordPress, and you'll make your life so much easier. So instead of just saying testing now, we can replace this, and we'll start by adding this component called panel body. What this does is it adds a panel that you can then put content into. It just makes the UI a little bit nicer. So now we have this panel with a little open and close button and testing. So you didn't have to build any of this, right? We just added panel body, we put testing inside of it, we gave it a title, done. We didn't have to code anything ourselves. Didn't have to create the toggle functionality, anything like that. And we're using the same UI as WordPress. So when WordPress updates, these components will be modified as needed to make sure that all the UI looks the same. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually add the field that people can add the starting year. And we're also going to add a way to toggle that on and off. So what we're going to do is we are going to start by pulling in those attributes that we created in block.json. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put those here. So, and I know I'm going a little fast, but I want to try and get this done before the end of our session here. If anything doesn't make sense, feel free to ask us questions in the chat, ask us questions later, and also refer to the tutorial itself. It goes into a lot more detail that I'm going through here. What we're going to need to do is in our edit component, we need to pull in the attributes and then this set attributes that allows us to update the attribute values. So the attributes again are from block.json. They're the show starting year and then the starting year. We're pulling those in and we're pulling out the show starting year and starting year. And then we're going to use the set attributes to update the attribute value whenever a user makes a change. Now that I'm pulling this in, I can add a text control and replace testing with my text control. Now, there is a link in the tutorial somewhere. Yep, there's a link right here that will bring you to the documentation on how to set up a text control. It gives you, what things you need, the different properties that it has. So I'm not going to go into all the different properties here because it's all available in the documentation. But basically what we have is we have a text control, we give it a label, we give it a value. So it's either starting year, or if the starting year doesn't exist, it's going to be just blank. And then we have this onChange property that whenever a user makes a change, update the starting year attribute with whatever value the user provided. So I'm going to save this. And when we come over to our edit and we refresh, we're now going to see that we have this text control. It's got a label. It's already pre-styled because we're using a WordPress component. And I'm going to type in 2000. And when I update this and refresh, you'll see that the 2000 was saved because whenever I made the change, it saved it as an attribute. And if I look at the code editor, you can see that I have my block here and I have my attribute starting year, and it's saved as part of the block and it's saving the attribute. Go back here. We did our starting year. Now what we need to do is, all right, this is going to get a little bit fancy here, but what we want to do is give the user the option to display a starting year or not. So this is true or false. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a toggle control for that. I'm just going to make my life easier and copy and paste, and I encourage you to do so. Just copy and paste, see how it works, and then you can go from there. So I'm going to start by adding a toggle control. I didn't copy. Again, we have a label, we have an onChange, and we have checked, basically, is this true or false, yes or no? And then what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our text control in a conditional. So this says, if show starting year, display our text control, and if not, it will be hidden. So when I come back over here, we refresh. Now I have this little toggle that says show starting year. Click that, and then I can enter my field or turn it off. Now, we've added a fair amount of functionality here, and really all I did was add these components and modify the labels and update the attributes. I didn't have to design a text control or anything. I'm just using the components that come with WordPress. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to update the content, right? Because when I make these changes, nothing is happening in the editor content. So we can make that change pretty easily. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to go over to we'll go back in our edit function. We're going to come up here and we're going to add this. Very descriptive. Basically, we have a variable that's called display date. And this says, if show starting year is turned on, true, and there's a starting year set, update the display date to show the starting year separated by a dash, and then the current year, which we get from our date function here. And that's our display date. Then we're going to take this display date and replace our current year with the display date. Now, when I save and refresh, see, when I toggle, I now have my starting year. And when I toggle it off, it's gone. And when I make a change, and then when I refresh, it works. So our editor is done. We're done with our editor. But of course, on the front end, we still just have this. So what we need to do now is we need to update the render.php file the same way. One of the unique things about, well, not unique, but one of the things that was a little confusing at first with this render.php file is that there are already some variables that are exposed to this file that you might not know about. It was not apparent that they're exposed to this file, but one of them is attributes. So what we can do here is we can copy and paste this. So we basically we already have attributes available to us. And these are the attributes from the block. Basically saying, if we have a starting year and show starting year is turned on, I want the display date to be the attribute starting year separated by a dash and then the current year. If the display date is otherwise, just display the current year. So I'm going to move this display up to above that like this. So our current year is just date Y, which we have here. Then we have this conditional, and this will be our display date here. Basically the same conditional that we had. We're using the attributes set on the block to determine whether we're showing the current year or starting year dash current year. Save that. Now, one of the really cool things about our dynamic block is that you can update the render.php file as much as you want, and you don't need to make any changes necessarily in the editor because we're rendering the block separately on the front end. So I've made the changes to render.php. I've already saved this in the editor. It already has the attributes applied. The attributes, already are applied, starting year true, starting year 2001, show starting year true. These are already applied and they're available on the front end. We just aren't doing anything with them yet right now. But when I refresh, you can now see it says copyright 2021 or 2001 to 2024. That's it. But I know we're at time, but I want to recap what we've done here. We've scaffolded a block. We've modified it. We've not only just modified it, we've added block supports. We've added custom attributes. And then we've used those attributes with built-in WordPress components. We've added a toggle control. We've added a text field. We're allowing the user to set and change those attributes. Those changing and setting of attributes modify the content in the editor so they're getting a live view in the editor of what the block looks like. And then on the front end, we're using those attributes and our render.php file to generate that content on the front end. So it seems like a simple block, but we've actually accomplished a lot in terms of the different functionality that you can use when you're building a block for the first time. So again, we didn't get to the whole tutorial. There's a second half about adding static rendering that gets a little bit more in the weeds. But I strongly encourage you to try, if you've never built a block before, try recreating what I just did by following this tutorial and see if you can get to this point. See if you can get to this point where you have your block here, looks the same on the front end, but then start changing it, then start modifying it to suit your own needs and just see how far you get with it. The reason we chose this really simple block is because the content actually doesn't matter. What matters is the using components, using supports, using attributes, because those are all the pieces that you'll need to build custom blocks on your own. So I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions, but for the sake of the demonstration and for the sake of the session, I'm going to stop the recording here. But
Just
again,
before you start the recording next, sorry, there's a great question about building for production, and I just wanted to mention it just to make sure it's in the recording as well. So when you're building for production, you're going to want to run a slightly different command. Nick's been running the start command, which is kind of like a dev version. So it builds out development files of all your block files, but you're going to want to run npm run build. And what that's going to do is that's going to take those same files, but then make them, it's going to obfuscate them and minify them and make them super, super small. So those are going to be your production build. And then when you bundle this plugin for release, or you want to put it on a server somewhere, you have to make sure that you include the build directory, because the build directory is actually where those files are being queued from and being loaded from. The source directory doesn't need to go live. You could, in fact, not include it. But that's a great question. So npm run build, and then if you run that, Nick, you can see that the contents of the build directory actually get a lot smaller. You'll lose the map files and stuff like that. So you'll see that the files look pretty big there, but they'll get
so let's watch this action. So we're in the index.js file in build. I'm going to run npm build.
You have to run build.
npm
run build. You don't have to put the run part with start, but that's an npm thing. So just the build. Yeah. So you can see it's building all that. So now if you look at the index.js, it's a much different file, much smaller.
It's all minified, all ready to go. And
sorry, go ahead, Nick.
I just wanted to call out. So when you'll notice here that in your main plugin file, this is the init action that's actually registering the block type, and it's registering from that build directory. So as Ryan mentioned, like if you're going to put this plugin on a website, or put it on WordPress.org or something like that, you don't need to include any of the source folder. It's just, or the node modules or anything. It's just the build folder, basically just the build folder and the main plugin file, because that's really all that's being used to actually generate the block in WordPress.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to include node modules. It could get massive. I have made that mistake where I've committed node modules to a Git repo, and I'm like, why is this thing 4 gigs? What's going on? So yeah.
All right, great. We will answer any questions here, post recording ending. But thank you all so much for attending. What better way to start 2024 than building your first block? And we are going to have many more sessions like this. We're actually in the process of planning 2 for February and another one for March. So, but before you go, I do want to share a event survey. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to continually improve these sessions and making sure they're as usable as possible. So there's a little form here that if you're so willing and want to fill out, that'd be fantastic. That will help us plan and make sure that we're providing content that's useful and useful for everybody as we move forward. So thank you all, and I hope you learned something today. And I hope you're also encouraged to build blocks. I mean, blocks are really the foundation of modern WordPress. And even if you're not building a block theme, blocks are going to be used in content, and it's a much more user-friendly way of editing content in WordPress, I believe. So I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you all, and hopefully we will see you on the next Developer Hours.